Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris, Assistant Professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Good morning, Sonali.
An armed attack on the offices of a French satirical magazine has left 12 people dead, including 2 policemen. It is being reported that at least 2 black-clad armed men wielding AK-47s burst into the magazine's offices this morning and indiscriminately shot people. French President François Hollande said the attack was, quote, without a doubt, an act of terrorism. A hunt is still on to find the attackers, who are suspected to have targeted the media institution over its depiction of Islam. The magazine, named Charlie Hebdo, is controversial for making light of religious figures and has been targeted in the past. This week's issue sports on its cover a book by Michel Houellebecq called Submission that portrays a future France that is run by Muslims and Sharia law. Meanwhile, here in the U.S., an explosion was reported at the offices of the NAACP in Colorado Springs. Apparently, an improvised explosive device was detonated, but no one was hurt. The FBI is searching for a white male suspect around 40 years old. Courtney, how do you see these stories? There are, of course, big differences, but is there a common thread?
Well, obviously both stories are very frightening. The massacre that took place at Charlie Hebdo is horrifying, and I think that in terms of what these 2 cases both demonstrate is that we, everywhere on the planet, we're living in a culture right now where violence is really supplanting our ability to engage in dialogue about our political disagreements. And it's something that I think is really frightening, especially in the context of France, where anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Islamic sentiment has become more and more pronounced over the last few years. And so it's much more difficult, I think, to talk about the complexities of the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and what are the limits of free speech, and how do we move beyond the kinds of differences that people might have about the place of immigrants in France, for example, without resorting to violence. So it's really troubling to see things playing out this way there, and it seems that it's creating a climate where it's going to be much harder to have a civil discourse about any of these matters that are so complex and require much more subtlety than I think we see most of the time in the mainstream media.
And the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has just announced that Palestine will join the International Criminal Court on April 1st. In fact, the UN website uses the phrase, quote, the state of Palestine, a term that Palestinians have longed to hear in the international community for decades. Mr. Ban has also approved more than a dozen other international conventions and treaties that Palestine will be a party to. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas submitted the ICC application after a resolution for statehood at the UN was vetoed by Israel's staunchest ally, the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded angrily, saying, quote, we will not let Israeli Defense Forces soldiers and officers be dragged to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Israel has already frozen tax revenues owed to the PA, while the U.S. has announced a review of its financial aid to Palestinians in retaliation. Courtney, if Palestinians can't have a formal state because the U.S. and Israel won't let them, don't they at least have a right to obtain justice in court?
Well, I think in theory that's the idea behind allowing Palestinians to join the ICC, although the kinds of justice that will be available to them in the International Criminal Court are limited. They can only bring criminal cases. They can't bring civil suits against the state of Israel. But they can recommend criminal cases to the court, and the court can then decide whether they want to hear them. So at this point, for example, the court has allowed, tentatively will be allowing Palestinians to retroactively recommend cases to the court going back to June of 2014. So this would allow the Palestinians to bring cases, war crimes, to allege war crimes against the state of Israel for the attacks that took place during Operation Protective Edge last summer. Right. So there really are some key openings there, but it remains to be seen how this is going to play out, particularly in the face of opposition from the United States in particular.
And finally, here in the U.S., on its very first day in power in Congress, the GOP took aim at benefits for the poorest Americans while setting in motion tax cuts for the richest. Republicans launched an assault on Social Security by adopting a rule change that would immediately cut benefits. It also adopted an obscure method of tracking budget projections called dynamic scoring, which critics, including the elder President Bush, have denounced in the past as, quote, voodoo economics, as it sets the stage for tax cuts for the wealthy. Such changes could be devastating to vulnerable Americans. Well, Courtney, Michael Hiltzik, writing for the LA Times, reported on this with his opening line being, well, that didn't take long. Are you amazed by how naked the GOP allegiance to wealth and privilege is?
Sonali, I can't say that I'm really surprised by anything the GOP does anymore. I think that probably more than most political actors in the United States, they're very clear about where their allegiances lie. They are committed free market fundamentalists. And so they're not interested in the kinds of social issues that affect most Americans. They are committed to defending the interests of the ruling class. And we see this not just in the defense of tax cuts, but also in their positions on climate change and the environment, the commitment to trying to reinvigorate the Keystone Pipeline project, which so many people have already voiced their opposition to, their commitment to supporting fracking. I mean, there are a number of issues that we could look at where they are clearly supporting, advocating for the interests of private corporations and the wealthy. So this is not surprising. But yeah, it was really fast.
Courtney, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.